as services, as water, electricity, transportation, everything, but to look at it in an integrated way. And this idea of cities as complex systems in general, it's already brought up, I think, by Miguel, was really introduced in several places, but it came actually first through cities and through, for example, so this is an old report, as you can see, from '58 by Warren Weaver, and he worked, for those of you who know, with Claude Shannon, the inventor of information theory. And he basically then played this role in public science in the United States of trying to tell you what kind of problems there were in science. And so these problems that we're talking about in cities are basically problems of what he called organized complexity, what we call today complex adaptive systems. And this was really taken up by, certainly in the United States, the most important urbanist of last century. That was Jane Jacobs. There she is. And she was basically reacting. New York City, many of you may not know, but New York City was the first big highway city in the United States. The big highway projects were all built in New York before they were built anywhere else. And so they were going to put, again, similar to the Marais, if you know New York City, they were going to put a highway right through the West Village where she lived. And she didn't like that. And so she was untrained as sort of a scientist or a planner, but she was a very good writer and a keen observer of people. So she wrote several books about how cities actually work, how streets work, how people move around, where shops are vibrant and when they're not. And what she always observed was that the interaction between space, services, people, businesses is really the fundamental thing to observe. And that you can observe at the level of streets and the level of blocks and so forth, from the bottom up, rather than from the top down, as you saw in the Corbu plans or the Brasilia plans. So that's really the challenge, and that's really what we're starting to do, is going from the top down, we got to the bottom, and now we go from the bottom up. What is it that we know from the bottom up, and what does that look like as a policy model? So the other place where this happened, almost at the same time, was in places like Mexico City. This is a thesis. It's a bit obscure, but I like really obscure documents by a man called Thomas Suter, who's still alive. And it's a thesis from 1967. And if you know urbanism, you know that Kevin Lynch and John F.C. Turner, his advisors, were actually very important figures in telling us how to think about cities in that period. But basically what you see there to the right is that he did very intense surveys of small neighborhoods, and he started mapping what they had, in terms of, that's income. So you see that's very manual, it's very simple. But he had these surveys to try to understand, how much money people had in different neighborhoods. What could they do? What kind of services could they afford? Was that, if you did something, was that recoverable from the point of view of costs and so forth? So this is really the beginning of having data that's very rich. And as you see there too, so those points on the x-axis is the amount of money that people make, and on the y-axis are different neighborhoods. You see that there's actually a large dispersion. These are all poorer neighborhoods in Mexico City in '67, or before that. And so you see that actually even in poor neighborhoods, there are people who actually make quite a bit of money. A lot of people are poor. It's just complicated. And this is, as you'll see, as we learn more about cities, this is what you find everywhere. Heterogeneity. Well, this then led, if you're familiar, many of you, I feel I'm kind of a little bit at the World Bank here, because it's sort of the same setup with these microphones and so forth, so it feels very familiar with that.
But the World Bank... definitely not that rich.
No, I know. So, but the World Bank then, there was a series of urbanists who started thinking about this, about basically the physical spaces of cities, not so much as built stuff that you build in a blueprint, but as processes. So John F.C. Turner, whose picture here, wrote several books in this period, in the 70s, based on some of this data by Suter and others. And he coined this idea of housing as a verb. We were just discussing public housing in Brazil. You undergoing one of the greatest projects in history. And the question is, what does that mean in terms of housing as a verb? What does housing do for people? How does it change people's lives? How will that housing work in 10 or 20 years? So it's really looking at that as a process where the social and economic lives of people are very much connected with the material infrastructure that you're providing and managing. And by looking at that, then you may have a different perspective for policy, but you have to know a lot more about people's lives. How might you do that? So, but that's the way, that's consciously or unconsciously, it's that sort of idea that allowed this to happen. So what you see here is Hong Kong. I'm not saying you do this in Brazil, but if you're in Asia, if you're in Hong Kong, you have to build, so it keeps going, okay? So these are public housing in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong and Singapore and other places in Asia are places where public housing is thought to have worked, meaning those buildings are still there, they improved, or they were substituted by better ones, people's lives improved, they fostered ownership and economic development at the household level. And so, and that's just incredible because these are the same buildings that we had in Europe or in the United States, but they've been run socially in very different ways. Ways that allow for ownership, for flexibility, for maintenance, so that you can move from one to another. So all kinds of social projects that really use housing as a verb rather than essentially as a thing, a noun, I suppose. Okay, and this is just finishing with Brazil and in terms of historical beginnings. This, I don't know how many would know this. This is an ethnography. It's done by a sociologist and ethnographer, James Holston, who's in the United States but lives in a long time in São Paulo. And so here the idea is precisely, it's in some sense revisiting Thomas Suter's studies, but it's in some sense also deeper because it follows the development of Brazil, from the olden days to what it is today, and the kind of things that we're discussing this morning about people's expectations and change and how that actually happens through the history of a city, in this case mostly São Paulo. But basically, how do you start with poor neighborhoods? They're basically replicating a life of subsistence where people lived, and increasingly those neighborhoods, not necessarily smoothly, start being transformed as networks of people in the city and services to those neighborhoods, so that life becomes urban life. So that process is political, is economic, but it basically has a translation in terms of things that we're talking about this morning as tools of complex systems. Basically how the networks of people working in the city or having friends, etc. in the city, the social networks develop so that you're not just in your neighborhood, but also how services, the physical networks, come to you and enable you to have that life. How does that process of building the city, both socially and infrastructurally, actually happen? So this is some of the best writing about an historical case, and it's about Brazil. In the United States, at least in certain realms, this is a very important book. I don't know how people feel in Brazil. Okay, so now I want to touch base a little bit with this morning, but in terms of cities. Why are cities complex systems specifically? So I want to touch on these several points. Again, Bernardo started in some sense there already this morning, more generally for other complex systems. But I'll give you examples for cities that I think will just make all these ideas very clear. So heterogeneity, cities are very different, people are very different from each other in a city, perhaps more so actually than in the countryside, which is interesting because we all have different professions, we all have slightly different lives, but also then neighborhoods are different, cities are different, etc. Then interconnectivity, the fact that actually I'll show you that we get different because we are connected, which is sort of interesting and provocative if you think about models from physics. Scaling, the fact that the properties of cities change with the size of that city, but that change is actually predictable in certain ways. So a lot of my early work on cities was really about mapping this from data, and I'll show you that. Circular causality, again, this issue. Do cities, for example, is a city rich because it has good infrastructure? Or does it have good infrastructure because it's rich? Which one is it? Well, hard to know, right? And development, so the idea that though there are some ideas of equilibrium that are important, most of the ways to look at complex systems and cities that they're changing, they're developing. And that change forces us to think about some sort of socio-economic evolutionary process of economic growth and other things, and not so much about a static allocational equilibrium as we train to do in economics, though those sometimes are useful in some parts of the problem, as I'll show you. So first, heterogeneity. We're doing this for Brazil now, but it wasn't quite ready. What you see there are two maps. On the left, Cape Town, South Africa. On the right, New York City. And what you see there is sort of all these colors, and these colors are basically small neighborhoods, census blocks for the United States. And basically what you see in color is the amount of money, the average income in each neighborhood. And so what you see is that it's actually not just red and green, though there are large-scale patterns, but it's very pixelated. And if you actually could see very well, there are bits of green in the red and bits of red in the green. So actually there are rich neighborhoods in the middle of poor neighborhoods and vice versa. It's very, very, very broad and very, very heterogeneous. So it's hard to say that a service at a certain level of cost, et cetera, may service all the city. Or you really have to, in many cases, start understanding what allows also cost recovery in a system like this, where some households can pay, a lot more than other households and so forth. So that's sort of an ingredient, and it's by no means a new ingredient. This is London in 1899. It was one of the first such census. And so what you see there is that blue is poor and red is very rich. So from one block, you cross the street and you go from one to the other. And this is a typical feature of all cities. And it's not just about socioeconomic things, it's ethnic, it's in terms of education, it's in terms of almost any dimension of life. You see these very diverse, but also very fast changing in space structures of cities. Okay. The other part is this idea of interconnectivity. So interconnectivity is also spatial. That's more or less obvious, so I won't spend time on it. But it's really this idea that, schematically, we should think of cities first as social networks. So the idea that really, before a city has good infrastructure, before, if you think about cities in history, they existed already as social systems that were connected. So what I try to represent there is basically a very simple social network where people have different relationships with different people. But it's really a social network of different people that are different colors, different things. And that's really the sense in which it also has an urban character. So let me just go through that example and start telling you how we now think about cities. And that will tell you also a bit about where the models and the data and some of this stuff comes from. I won't do much math, but I'll give you all the ideas. So the idea then is that I can go from that more complicated plot where I, in principle, could know each one of you and all the relationships you have with all different people. Of course, no one knows that, despite all this stuff about big data. But you can start abstracting it as a term in terms of a series of relationships. So this is called a graph mathematically. But, many of us spend a lot of time dealing with this sort of properties. And then the thing that's really crucial about cities is that they do exist in space. So what this is supposed to be is our hero over there. She lives in that little orange house, and she's just going to go around the city and do her life. So every one of these little dots of different colors, she's interacting with somebody. And those things, let me just click through it. So she's going through the city, and so she collects a bunch of interactions, and these interactions then bring things to her life, good and bad. She may catch a disease, she may see a doctor, she may find someone she likes or someone she doesn't like anymore. She may go to a job or sell something and vice versa. And so really the point is that the properties that we measure about cities are properties that exist all along in people's lives, and that you can think about cities as sort of these trajectories through space. They're also trajectories through social space, where people interact with different people. So today here, maybe we're discussing complex systems and we're all learning from each other. But you go home, you do other things at home, etc. So you can think of your life as sort of this trajectory through space. And it's really this that creates the social contacts that you have and maintains them and so forth. And this is really important because then it's the space that we build, the space, this is supposed to be an American city, of course, or maybe Brasilia, but not quite, with straight streets and so forth. That's what that was supposed to be, and highways, and middle-sized streets and small streets. So if you take this perspective, then now space matters. And the way we organize space conditions also how many interactions we can have, how safe those interactions are, and so forth, and therefore allows you to build these socioeconomic lives. So it's really these, sometimes now we call them multiplex networks, but the network of infrastructure, the network of roads and paths, and the network of people. And when you go to a larger city, this is sort of what happens, is that space changes and interactions change. You have more people to interact with, mostly strangers. So your life has more things that happen per unit time because there are more people to interact with. And it turns out, for reasons that I'll explain a little bit later, that the highways get fatter. You know all about this in Brasilia. And some of the middle roads also get bigger because the city is larger, and so there's more in terms of flows and so forth. And this change of space and of social space together is actually basically what cities are doing. They're permitting you and each one of us to live in a space that has more social interactions per unit time. And this means that the rate at which we create things that are social, from good things like money or learning to bad things like crime, is higher. So cities accelerate social life. That's essentially what they do. And I'll tell you